In the middle of the Virginia night, as a chorus of crickets chirp in the distance, Mildred Jeter nervously announces to her longtime beau, Richard Loving, that she's pregnant. After a shocked moment of silence, Richard bursts into an excited smile. He's a quiet, simple man of few words, but genuine honest actions. He takes Mildred's hand, squeezing it reassuringly, suddenly enlivened about the future of their soon-to-be family. Richard, despite being white in 1950s Virginia, works with a team of colored race car drivers as one of their mechanics. He's the only white person in the group, and sticks out like a sore thumb, and likely an oddity to the opposing, all-white race team. The two teams race and Richard's team wins, much to the delight of his peers. The white team isn't happy about losing to a team of mostly colored people, of course, and very reluctantly hand over their winnings. As Virgil, the team's driver, returns to the team with his hat full of money, the opposing team stares daggers at Richard, who's very openly affectionate with Mildred, much to their disdain. Even at social events, Richard hangs with all the colored folk, often the only white person at the party. After the race, the group celebrate with drinking and dancing, and Mildred watches in amusement as Virgil grabs her little sister, Garnet, to dance. Even here, Richard is openly affectionate with Mildred, however less people seem to mind. Richard works building houses, and one day, he works particularly quickly in order to finish up before he heads out. He's meeting Mildred. He takes her to a field and places a stick in the ground, asking for her opinion on the location. Mildred is confused, considering they're just standing in a field not a half a mile away from the home she grew up in all her life. Of course she likes it. With a satisfied nod, Richard starts discussing floor plans, and Mildred is even further confused, begging him to explain. Trying to contain his grin, Richard happily announces that he's bought the entire acre and intends to build Mildred a house on that very spot, their house. Mildred looks around the land with new eyes as everything begins to sink in, but Richard isn't done yet. Pulling her in close, Richard softly asks Mildred to marry him. Though she shouldn't be running in her condition, unable to contain her excitement, Mildred runs over to the fields to fetch her Garnet from work, to give her the news. Mildred isn't sure when they'll be married yet, but she knows it'll be soon, before the baby comes. Garnet is overjoyed for her, but is also afraid that she might lose her sister. It's risky for colored people to have interracial relationships, let alone children in marriage. Mildred assures her that she'll be just down the road, and that everything will work out fine. The sisters embrace, giggling ecstatically. Richard returns home just as his mother, Lola Loving, finishes up with another client. She's a midwife. Richard greets her in the usual fashion, and she directs him to the back, where Raymond, a member of Richard's racing team and one of his dearest friends, is already in the garage tinkering with the car. Richard jumps in to assist, sharing the news of his engagement with Raymond. Raymond seems a little unsure about the plan, but offers his support anyway, asking if they need a witness, but Richard already intends to take Mildred's father as the witness. Virgil joins the two, and Raymond shares the news with him. However, Virgil's reaction is very obviously averse to marriage. He thinks Richard and Mildred would be fine just living together, and doesn't understand people's need to get married. Richard chuckles softly at his friend, knowing Virgil talks like that because he's never experienced love, and wouldn't comprehend it. On the day of their marriage, Richard drives Mildred and her father, Jake, up to DC. Mildred tries making conversation with her father on what the city's like, but he gives a bland answer. Noting the fact that Jake doesn't seem particularly enthused about the occasion, Richard thanks him for coming again. While Richard and Mildred share a smile in the front seat, Jake seems anxious about what's about to happen. The service is very simple, with the couple married under traditional Christian rites with Jake as their sole witness. The deed is done, they're pronounced man and wife, and they drive back down to Virginia in no time at all. Mildred flashes her new gold ring to Garnet, who pouts about not being able to be there when her sister married. Mildred admits that the reason they went all the way to Washington was because Richard said there'd be less red tape. At night, Richard stays up late sketching out his plans for their future house. Their life goes on as it usually does. Richard spends his days working, while Mildred stays home and sews, her pregnant belly getting larger and larger. In public, the couple go on showing affection like they usually do, completely unaware that they're being watched with scornful eyes. One day, as Richard returns home from work and greets his mother as usual, she informs him that the sheriff's deputy came by looking for him today. They didn't say what they wanted, and Lola had nothing to tell them. Richard nods, noting the information. Later on, he hangs a framed copy of his and Mildred's marriage license in their bedroom. After a lively dinner with Mildred's family, the couple retire to bed together. Under cover of darkness in the middle of the night, suddenly their bedroom door is kicked in, and Richard is dragged out of bed by police officers. Mildred wakes, startled, and she's interrogated as to what she's doing in bed with a white man. Meekly, Mildred points out that she's his wife, and Richard points to their marriage license for proof. But as far as the sheriff's concerned, that's no good here. The couple are ordered to get dressed, and are dragged out of the house and carted to the station, where they're both thrown in jail, in different cells, of course. Richard tries to assure Mildred she'll be okay, and she rubs her swollen belly anxiously. The next morning, an officer comes to collect Richard at his cell. Someone's posted his bail. As he's walked past Mildred's cell, he tries to go for her, but he's the only one that's been bailed out. The officer drags him back and threatens him with bodily harm if he attempts to go for Mildred again. And reluctantly, Richard exits the holding cells, grumbling about the injustice his wife is being forced to endure because of her skin color. As he's led out of the station, he passes the sheriff, who eyes him with palpable disgust. When signing out of the station, Richard inquires as to Mildred's fate, and he's informed he'll have to talk to a judge about it on Monday, meaning Mildred must remain in jail the entire weekend. Richard is completely shaken and frustrated, unsure of what to do. He exits the station in a huff, where he finds Raymond waiting to take him home. At home, Lola is in the middle of a delivery and utilizes Richard's assistance. As he goes outside to empty a pail for her, he picks up a cigarette, scratching at the crease in his forehead. Raymond wonders what his next move is, but Richard's more concerned with how the police knew to come and get them. Raymond believes the answer is obvious: someone talked. But it could have been anyone. Richard surveys his neighbors with a growing distrust. Lola watches as her son hangs his head, feeling powerless to help his beloved wife. Richard goes back to the station and causes a ruckus the next day, trying to get Mildred out, but he's given the same runaround of talking to a judge. He tries arguing with the clerk, saying he'll get a lawyer, but the clerk insists they can't release Mildred to him, and he's within his rights to get a lawyer if he so chooses. On his way out, Richard is stopped by the sheriff, who invites him into his office. Sitting him down, he plainly tells Richard to send some of her people to the station to get her, because there's no way they'd release her to Richard. The sheriff thinks that as a white man, Richard ought to know better than to associate with colored people so intimately, but figuring that maybe he doesn't. Considering Richard's background of being from Central Point and having a father who worked for a colored man, the sheriff decides that he feels sorry for him. Richard must be all mixed up in the head from those experiences, he figures, so the sheriff sees it fit to explain to him the way things should be. He believes that it's God's law that the races should be separate, and neither he nor the people of Virginia will stand for their mixing. He sends Richard home with the final threat of arresting him again, should he attempt to bail Mildred out one more time. With no other choice, Richard arranges for Mildred's father to post her bail, and she's released from the station. Running straight into her father's arms, she weeps as he comforts her. They drive back home, where she is welcomed warmly by her sister, but not Richard. They inform her that he's moved his things out, and he must avoid being seen with her so the police don't arrest them again. Under the cover of night, though, Richard sneaks across to Mildred's house, sneaking in silently. He visits her in her room, and the two finally embrace after being separated and persecuted for days. Mildred confides in Richard that she's scared and confused, but Richard assuages her worries, explaining that he's gotten a lawyer who will handle everything. All they need to do is lay low for a while. Reluctantly, he gives a final, tight hug before he leaves her, not wanting to stay too long. On his way out, he's spotted by Garnet, who gives him a dirty look for what she believes he's put her sister through. Mildred and Richard meet with the lawyer, Frank Beasley, who lays out the current situation for them. Mr. Beasley is personal friends with Judge Basil, and has already met with him personally to work out a deal. Judge Basil is willing to suspend any prison time if the couple plead guilty, but in exchange, unless Richard and Mildred get divorced, they'll be forced to leave their home state of Virginia for up to 25 years. Beasley believes it's an easy choice, but it's a terribly harsh blow to the couple, especially Mildred, to have to pack up and leave their family and friends behind. While on their way to the court, the couple are briefed on how to interact with the judge, particularly Mildred, who's told to keep quiet, as Judge Basil already dislikes people of her color. The trial's charges states that Richard, being a white person, unlawfully conspired to marry Mildred, a colored person, by leaving the state lines in order to marry her in Washington, and that their return to and cohabitation in the state of Virginia is against the peace and dignity of the Commonwealth. The couple hangs their heads as they plead guilty and hear the charges read. Ordered to leave at once, the couple pack up, and Mildred says a tearful goodbye to her family. She gives her mother a warm hug, leaving the phone number for where they're going. Her father gives her a strong and silent nod, but when she gets to Garnet and kisses her cheek, her baby sister explodes with rage at Richard for what he's done. She, too, claims he knew exactly what the consequences would be if they were to get married. Mildred is saddened, but doesn't chase after her sister, only hoping that in time, maybe she'll understand. Richard gives a final, masculine nod towards Jake, before the couple get in the car and begin their journey towards Washington, D.C. There, they will stay with a friend of Mildred's. Mildred isn't fond of the city, the only patch of grass being a tree on the sidewalk in front of the house. Still, she greets her friend fondly as she welcomes them both into the house, and heads inside with optimism. That night though, Mildred can't catch a wink of sleep. On the inside, her heart aches for her home. They try to carry on with their life as per usual. Richard finds work, while Mildred adjusts to being a city housewife, getting deeper into her pregnancy. Richard notices one night that she's still quite depressed, even after settling in, and he's deeply concerned. While in bed, he pulls her close, asking what he could possibly do to ease Mildred's pain, and at first she says it's nothing. But after some gentle nudging, she admits that she's always wanted Lola to deliver their baby. Pulling back, Richard thinks about it for a moment. It's an extremely risky decision, but he knows it'd mean the world to his little string bean, so he agrees. The couple load up the car and head out. Richard is alert and on edge as he drives back to Virginia, while Mildred hides under a blanket in the back seat. They stop on a dark road in the middle of the night, where Raymond pulls up to meet them, driving like a bat out of hell. Mildred switches cars and is taken to Lola's house by Raymond, where Richard meets them later. Richard arrives to the sight of Mildred surrounded by her family, looking the most at peace she's been in the past few months, and he's instantly relieved. He greets Lola as per usual, and she immediately puts him to work. Mildred gives Garnet a look, and her younger sister gets up, swallowing her pride to do what she knows she must. Garnet's had time to think, and seeing how far Richard is willing to go to make Mildred happy has cemented her forgiveness for him. She thanks Richard for doing this for her sister, and with that, Raymond breaks the emotional ice with a motivational line for Mildred. The next morning, Garnet calls Richard in when Mildred's water breaks. He stays by her side for as long as he's allowed to while she's in labor. That evening, as Lola comes outside to empty a pail, Richard takes the moment to thank his mother, but even Lola pauses to tell him that he never should have married Mildred. Richard thought his mother had liked her, and Lola likes her just fine. She likes a lot of people, but she still believes that Richard shouldn't have married her, saying the same thing that everyone else keeps telling him, "You knew better." Hearing these words from his own mother, there's a burning, bitter sadness that settles in him, as he wonders what could possibly have been so wrong about wanting to marry a woman that he loves. The next day, Garnet lovingly coos to the newest member of the loving family, Sydney. Just as she hands off the bundle of joy to Mildred, two cop cars approach and surround Lola's house. His protective instincts kicking in, Richard orders Mildred to call the lawyer immediately and goes outside to face Sheriff Brooks himself. The sheriff doesn't hesitate in demanding Mildred come out as well, and Richard tries to pretend she isn't there. But the sheriff isn't stupid, and threatens to arrest every person in the house if Richard doesn't bring Mildred out. Mildred takes a last look at Sydney, steeling herself to face the consequences of her actions, the consequences of her love. Kissing Sydney goodbye, she hands the baby off to Garnet, grabs her coat and bravely walks outside, heading straight to the police car and sitting calmly in the back seat as if she were going for a luxurious, chauffeured ride. Seeing his wife's bravery, Richard follows suit, and the two are carted off. Luckily, Judge Basil is in today, so they're carried straight to the court. Just as the judge is about to slap them with a $200 bond, Frank Beasley enters the courtroom in a huff, rushing to interrupt the court's proceedings. He explains to Judge Basil that he incorrectly told the Lovings that they could return to Virginia for the birth of their child, and begs him for leniency. Judge Basil lets them go, and after the proceedings, as Richard attempts to thank Beasley, he warns them not to come back again. There won't be leniency a second time. With their newborn baby and a slap on the wrist, the couple return to Washington and make the best they can of their life in the city. The years pass, and the couple end up having two more children together, another son, Donald, and their youngest daughter, Peggy. Garnet comes up to Washington to visit occasionally, too. As Garnet takes in how much the children have grown, and gives Mildred the update on all her family and friends, and their children, Mildred can feel her frustration with her current home growing by the moment. She feels like her children are caged, forced to expend all their energy jumping around the house, because they don't even have a yard or any grass to run in. She's left a little down after Garnet's visit, and Richard notices this. One night, as she watches a broadcast of the Great March on Washington, seeing thousands of colored people protesting for their civil liberties stirs her own inner lust for liberation. Noting her interest, her friends suggest she write a letter to the Attorney General at the time, Robert F. Kennedy. Mildred contemplates her decision for a while, and deciding she's got nothing left to lose, writes the letter. One day, while attending to the usual chores, Mildred gets a phone call from Mr. Bernard Cohen, a lawyer from the American Civil Liberties Union, explaining that Mr. Kennedy was unfortunately unable to directly assist in her situation, and that he sent her letter on to them. Mr. Cohen would like to meet with the Lovings to discuss taking on their case, pro bono. For a moment, Mildred is speechless, overwhelmed with a sense of hope she's never experienced, and she agrees to meet with him. She sits in disbelief once the call is over. Things might really be changing. That night, Mildred gives Richard the update on her earlier conversation, stating her intentions of meeting with Mr. Cohen, subtly hinting that she plans to attend, whether Richard accompanies her or not. Bernard arrives in Washington on Thursday, at his friend's office that he's borrowed just for this meeting, so that he can appear more professional and well-established, when in fact, Bernard has only been out of law school for a couple years. He sets up the office just in time for the Lovings' arrival and welcomes them, full of polite charm. As he begins explaining what he thinks is the best procedure for trying the case, first, filing an appeal and trying to get it to the federal court, Richard interrupts him upon hearing those words. Richard is greatly confused as to why the case needs to go all the way to the federal court, as if it were some sort of major crime. Why couldn't Bernard just work something out with Judge Basil instead? Bernard states that he doesn't believe this case will be settled in any court in the state of Virginia, much less Judge Basil's court, and that this is a case that could go all the way to the Supreme Court. In order to do that, he has a risky idea to have the Lovings get rearrested, as the time limit for appealing their case has long since passed. This way, the case becomes active again. The Lovings, having been so severely traumatized from their past 2 arrests, are very obviously against this idea. Seeing their reaction, Bernard apologizes for his insensitive idea and resolves to find another way to pursue the appeal. Mrs. Loving gives him a nod of appreciation, but Richard, ever the skeptic, still isn't sold. Mildred decides that if it gets them home, they'll take the ACLU's help, but Richard believes you get what you paid for, which in this case is a whole lot of nothing. One day, as the Loving boys play in the street with the neighborhood children, young Donald is hit by a car. Luckily, he's only mildly injured, but this event marks the last strike for Mildred. Richard returns home that evening to find a house in darkness and a stack of packed trunks in the living room. He runs upstairs to Mildred and his children, fearing the worst, and she explains what ill befell their son today. Away from the children, Mildred expresses her desire to move back to the country. She doesn't care what the police do to them anymore. She refuses to raise her family in this concrete jungle. Richard glances at the packed trunks and back at his wife, recognizing the pain within her and understanding her feelings. He knows what he must do for his family. The Lovings pack up their things yet again, and Mildred bids goodbye to her friends. She takes one car with the children, while Richard drives in a separate vehicle. The couple meet up with Raymond at a house they're staying at temporarily. Raymond suggests they move into a remote farmhouse in King and Queen County, just outside the county lines, that a friend of his has for sale. It's close enough to home, but secluded enough that no one will know where to find them, unless they know where to look. Richard agrees, and soon the family move out to the house. As Mildred arrives at the house and steps onto the lawn, she takes a moment to bask in the Virginia sunlight and listen to the birds sing to her once again. She breathes in the air of home, and it's like a piece of her soul has returned to her. She's free again, and so are her children. Richard is lost, admiring her for a moment, but he can't shake his paranoid habit of having to look around and ensure his family is safe. One day Mildred pens a letter, checking in with Bernard, who they haven't heard from in quite some time. Upon receiving her letter, Bernard sets up a meeting with his former teacher for advice on the case, and when he arrives, he's introduced to Mr. Phil Hershkup, a man his teacher describes as a brilliant civil rights lawyer. Bernard explains the Loving situation to his professor, and how he tried filing a motion to appeal with Judge Basil some time ago, but his office keeps stonewalling. Bernard wants to take the case far enough that they can get the anti-miscegenation law overturned nationwide. On the way out of the meeting, Phil and Bernard get to talking shop on different ways to tackle the case. However, it's clear that Phil is the more versed attorney in this field, making Bernard aware of certain risky choices he's made with the Loving's future and his appealing the case. Phil advises Bernard to get familiar with constitutional law, as what he's attempting to do could possibly change the entire constitution of the USA. Lola, despite her previous reservations about their marriage, visits the Loving's home and bonds with Mildred, teaching her how to make country-style biscuits and playing tea house with her granddaughter. While Richard is outside, working on the roof, he spots a car speeding towards the lone road to his house, and all his protective instincts, heightened by being constantly on edge, set off alarm bells in his head. Speeding down the ladder, he yells at Lola to get the children inside and puts Mildred on alert, unconsciously gripping the hammer he was wielding with a tight fist, ready to swing. Raymond's car pulls up, and he exits casually, as per usual. Richard quickly asks him what's going on, preparing for anything. But Raymond simply says he has a message to deliver. The lawyer called and would like to speak with them. Richard wonders why the hell Raymond would drive like that if it wasn't an emergency, but Raymond is confused. He's always driven like that. As the adrenaline starts wearing off in Richard's system, he can feel himself crashing. Constantly being on guard is exhausting. With an exasperated sigh, he retires inside to rest. The Lovings meet with Bernard and Phil, who give the couple some good news about their case. Judge Basil has ruled against them once again, but this has now opened up the avenue for them to appeal to the federal court, which, if ruled against again, will allow them to head to the Supreme Court. Mildred thinks that's wonderful news, but Bernard has one more tidbit of housekeeping he'd like to suggest in order to raise the profile of the case. A photographer from Life magazine has reached out to them and would like to do a photo shoot of the Loving family in their home. Richard remains silent, preferring to keep his life private, but Mildred agrees to do it, assuring them that everything will be fine. While working on his vehicle one day, Richard is interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Gray Villett, the photographer from Life magazine. He's a tall, slender guy with an easygoing personality, and engages Richard in car talk from the moment they meet, momentarily disarming him of his closed-off tendencies. As Gray walks off to greet Mildred, Richard twists his mouth, unsure of what to make of the man. But by dinner time, Gray has the entire Loving family laughing heartily at his adventurous stories. After dinner, Gray spends some time chatting with Mildred as she washes up, inquiring how she feels about the incoming trials. Mildred's almost sure they'll lose, but she believes it's okay. They might lose the small battles, but win the larger war. Gray nods, understanding what she means, and he feels a deep respect for Mildred's profound strength. Inspired to remember her at that moment, he snaps a photo. Gray also joins Richard and Mildred in their simple, intimate moments as they watch TV together after the kids have gone to sleep. Richard lays his head in Mildred's lap as they laugh at their show, and Gray can't help but observe how pure their love is. There's no difference at all between the love of same-race relationships. Gray sneakily captures some candid photos, so as not to disturb their beautiful moment, and smiles to himself, grateful he got to experience the loving family firsthand. Mildred and Richard are interviewed after the federal court ruling, and Bernard doesn't miss his opportunity to peacock for the cameras as well. In front of a team of reporters, he erroneously promises the Lovings that he'll ensure their safe passage through Virginia during the trials, and to bail them out should they run into any trouble with the police. And when the cameras are gone, Phil calls him out on his grandiose promises. One day after work, when Richard returns to his car, he finds a brick on his front seat, wrapped with a page of the article from Life magazine, a clear threat. He looks around at his co-workers suspiciously, wondering who it could be. On his way home, he notices a van on the road behind him, and fearing he's being followed, he begins to speed in an attempt to evade his pursuers. He gets home at dusk, and still on high alert, calls Sidney, ordering him to run to neighbors and use their phone to call Raymond and inform him to bring his gun over. Mildred comes out, concerned about the ruckus, but Richard assures her it's fine and sends her inside. That night, Richard and Raymond stay awake all night guarding the porch. Raymond finally realizes how much Richard's paranoia has progressed, and tries to suggest that the truck he saw was likely going fishing, to assuage him, but to no avail. Richard has a phone installed in the house in case of emergencies. One day, Richard arrives home to find a strange car parked outside. Wandering in, he catches Mildred in the middle of an interview, blushing like a young Hollywood starlet. Richard pulls her outside and explains he doesn't want these strangers in his home. He's fed up with the cameras and publicity. He just wants his simple life back, but Mildred is defiant, believing the reporters just want to help, and that it's important for them to tell their story. Richard grinds his teeth for a bit, but ultimately puts his uncomfortable feelings aside and joins Mildred as a quiet supporter during the interview. While back in Virginia, Richard takes the moment to reconnect with his old race team, watching the boys race during the day and grabbing drinks with them at night. As the boys knock them back, Virgil admits to missing Richard a little bit, but then begins teasing him about now knowing what a hard life really is. Virgil lays it out how he sees things, despite how much Richard likes to think that he's black and hang around black people. At the end of the day, when he goes to work, he's still white. The way Virgil sees it, Richard was born with a privilege and position that every black man, including himself, naturally envies, and Richard is a fool for ruining that all for a woman. For Virgil, Richard's misfortunes are an easy fix. All he has to do is divorce Mildred. Drunkenly, Richard laughs off the idea, but it's coated with bitterness that he doesn't show to any of his friends. He returns home to Mildred, drunk and sadly grumbling about their situation. They've been talking to lawyers for almost 10 years now, and he wonders at what point will they ever get a reprieve from this persecution. Richard is a hard-working, honest and dedicated man who would give anything to protect and provide for his family. And yet his masculine abilities seem to constantly come into question, solely because he married a woman of a different skin tone than him. He could take care of Mildred as well as any other man could, and he sobs softly as he tries to reassure her of this. Mildred hadn't realized her husband is being affected this way, but as any good wife would, faithfully, she comforts him. Bernard and Phil visit the Lovings one chilly winter day to announce the good news. The Supreme Court has agreed to hear their case. Phil admits it will be difficult, but he thinks they have prepared a good counter-argument for the state of Virginia's defense. Having done a little research, and now attempting to actively show interest for the sake of his wife, Richard inquires as to what the state of Virginia's defense would be. The lawyers sober a bit, not wanting to say exactly what the opposing argument would be. Bernard tries to tiptoe around it, but Phil comes out with it, breaking the ice. They explain to the Lovings that the state of Virginia will argue that it's unfair to bring children of mixed race into the world, believing that the children are bastards. Richard recoils at the nasty implication about his beloved children. Bernard invites the Lovings to attend the trial and hear the arguments. They have the right to, as the defense, but Richard vehemently refuses. He won't subject his family to such humiliation. They've been through enough, though Mildred looks mildly disappointed. When the lawyers ask Mildred, she admits she won't go without him. Bernard steps outside to have a final chat with Richard before leaving, asking if there's anything he'd like Mr. Cohen to tell the Supreme Court justices of the USA on his behalf. After a moment, Richard nods, saying simply to tell the judges that he loves his wife. Butterflies in their stomachs, the young lawyers climb the stairs to the Supreme Court building, preparing to change history, the lives of possibly thousands of Americans, and particularly the lives of one sweet, Virginian couple. During the trial, Phil and Bernard give extremely moving statements, presenting the argument that laws prohibiting interracial marriage are foundationally unconstitutional. They argue that marriage is a fundamental right which should be equally granted to all, and attempt to prove the point that interracial marriage poses no threat to the state of Virginia, or the people. One day, Mildred gets a call from Bernard giving her the fantastic news. In the case of Loving and Virginia, the Lovings won. Mildred can hardly believe it. She glances outside to her family, basking in the Virginia sun, and smiles at Richard. The Lovings become a national sensation, being hounded by reporters for interviews on their groundbreaking case. Finally, after years of fighting, the family is free and returns to Virginia, where Richard begins building the house he promised Mildred, on the land he proposed to her with.